Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Carl Raschke. His last name is spelled Raschke. And he came to my attention. I was looking through some of the research files for Julian West that are located at UCLA, and I saw his name pop up. And I had read this book that we're going to talk about, Painted Black, back when I was really at the beginning of really researching Aleister Crowley. This was kind of one of the known books that deals with occultism. So that's kind of going to be the theme. And Professor and author Raschke is going to talk about what it took to write this, and also the critiques, and also his view on the critics of him for writing this book. But there's a lot of information in the book. It's an excellent book. I was reading through it again today. I'm going to go through the back. The full title of the book is Painted Black: From Drug Killings to Heavy Metal, The Alarming True Story of How Satanism is Terrorizing Our Communities, published October 1st, 1990. Carl Raschke is professor of philosophy of religion at the University of Denver and director of its MA program. He is the past chair of the department. He specializes in continental philosophy, political theology, the philosophy of religion, art theory, globalization theory, and the theory of religion. He was chosen university lecturer for 2020-2021. He is an internationally known writer and academic who's authored numerous books and hundreds of articles on topics ranging from postmodernism to popular religion and culture to technology and society. His recent books include Neoliberalism and Political Theology, From Kant to Identity Politics, published 2019, A Postmodern Theology, a Biopic, 2017, Critical Theology, An Agenda for an Age of Global Crisis, 2016, Force of God, Political Theology and the Crisis of Liberal Democracy, 2015. Postmodernism and the Revolution in Religious Theory Toward a Semiotics of the Event, 2012. He is the senior editor for the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory and senior consulting editor of the New Polis. He's also a director and officer for the White Stone Foundation. From 2016 to 2018, he served as managing editor for Political Theology Today, which I think is now called the Political Theology Network. He's been a visiting scholar at the University of Vienna, as well as Rice University, and regular adjunct at the Seattle School for Theology and Psychology. But again, we're going to talk about this great book. It's titled Painted Black. And we talked a little bit, like I said earlier, he came up in the research stuff for Julian West that I'm kind of working on with Philip Fairbanks. And we talked kind of about through email about why he thinks he was there and some of the kind of cult war, kind of canned cult awareness network stuff that he knows more about. So, Carl Raschke, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So, for people who may not have heard your name or this book, maybe you can talk about your, career background and kind of what led you to write this. Seems to be kind of an outlier considering your other academic work.
Well, yeah. I wrote this book because I was asked to by an editor at, or I should say, a acquisitions editor for HarperCollins, because at the time it was all over the news, and they were looking for somebody who had academic status, which I did, to write a book about this topic. And I also had a journalistic background. My first career back in the late 60s was as a journalist in California. During the heyday of the counterculture. Yeah, that's why it's a little bit of an outlier. It's not, it wasn't, and it still isn't what I've noted for in the academic world. In fact, I would think that most people in the academic world look at it like, well, that's okay. That's kind of like eccentric sort of side trip that he took and what he did. But actually, I had started working in the 70s and 80s in what is now somewhat euphemistically called the new religious movements. Then it was popularly called cults. Both those terms are kind of not descriptive of what's really going on. One is kind of too bland, and you might consider it to be, sort of evasive of the deeper issues. The other, cults, I think, is much too strong because it becomes, that's a cult, this is a cult. No, so we need some kind of more nuanced terminology, but unfortunately, words mean what the public tends to use them for. And right now, I think there's an effort to try to be a little bit more nuanced, but the media doesn't really care about the issues anymore the way they did in the 70s and 80s. But basically what I was doing in the late 70s and 80s and was writing about the whole kind of alternative religious phenomena that started in California and kind of reached a fever pitch, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area where I had lived and going to high school, and went to college and got my master's degree before I went back east to get my doctorate. And when I got to Colorado, or as we jokingly called it during the time, Colorado, all of this kind of stuff, like, you know, a storm front, was moving east and was taking over the Rocky Mountain region. And I started teaching at the University of Denver in the early 70s, and virtually half my class was following some kind of guru or some kind of way of, you know, opening your mind to cosmic consciousness, the way it was called, and so forth. And a lot of that, you know, looking back, and I analyzed it in some published articles at the time, was really an effort to try to get off mind-expanding drugs, which had serious side effects and consequences, and was destroying people's minds, if not their bodies. You know, that was the baby boomer generation. The millennials and Gen X today think we're all this kind of conservative, you know, block of people they saw in their parents, but actually that the baby boomers were a lot more radical in their lifestyles than any millennials could have imagined today. So anyway, I was writing about all that and kind of, you know, if you want to just, you know, speak kind of off the cuff craziness of that period. And I thought, well, you know, this is interesting with my journalistic experience and background. You know, I can go out, talk to people, interview, visit certain kind of seances or salons or whatever. I didn't really know much about it, and I hadn't taken much interest, but it was just ubiquitous in Denver at the time. So I became kind of slowly developed as a scholar at it. I became recognized, you know, right around the time I got tenure for the first time in the late 70s. You know, I got recognized that as somebody who can speak authoritatively about this. And then in the mid 80s, there was this whole phenomenon called the New Age movement. And I became the instant authority on the New Age movement. It was funny because just kind of randomly through a series of references, a writer for the New York Times was doing an article on what is the New Age movement. You know, Shirley MacLaine was coming to prominence with her books and also, you know, her movies and so forth. But of course, none of this stuff was really new. It was just a kind of branding and marketing of what had already been going on in the counterculture for the last 15 years. What I discovered in, I think it was 1986, that if you get quoted on the cover of the New York Times, you're everybody's authority for perpetuity. And so all of a sudden I started getting media interviews. I was on virtually every major talk show, including Good Morning America, you know, whatever it was, you know, whatever the latest New Age fashion or cult phenomenon, as it was beginning to be called, came down the pike. I really didn't deal a lot with Satanism. I only kind of discovered Satanism late in the game, and it was through my study of UFO contactees, people who claim to be UFO contactees, that I learned about Satanism. And there was also a guy who I mentioned, I call him Jim Jones, John Jones, I'm sorry, in the preface painted black, but he was a former drug dealer from Pueblo, Colorado. John Jones was his real name, but he had a very generic name just like that. And he told me all this kind of weird stuff that was going on, which I didn't believe at first, or I was a little skeptical about it. But I always had this habit, you know, of listening to what people have to say and not making snap judgments, even though it may seem really out there on a limb. And lo and behold, through inquiries and using my journalistic tracking skills, I began to find out, well, maybe there is some kind of plausibility to some of this. So that's how I got into the subject of Satanism. And because my already existing notoriety as a cult expert, you know, once I published an article, and it was with a kind of quasi-religious journal. I think it was called a Spiritual Counterfeits Project. They asked me to write about Satanism. I said, sure, I'll give it a try. I don't know much about it as I do know about the New Age movement, but I'll write about it. Well, apparently there was a famous person who was promoting Satanism as his own brand at the time who got a hold of the article and got really upset. And I had been fed a lot of the information from his ex-girlfriend. Who was known to another academic at the time, who was an anthropologist, who introduced me to her. This is the anthropologist, by the way, that helped break the case with the FBI in the early '80s, the Allen Berg killing. That was where the white supremacist movement, the order, that famous, I don't know if anybody remembers that, it's history, but it was a pretty big thing at the time. So there was a kind of network of, we might call independent public interest researchers out there who all began to contact. And so I would gather their information, I would talk about it. The irony was there were virtually no academic experts that would even touch this stuff. And, I found it, I didn't like all the publicity. It was basically, it was a huge, waste. I wouldn't say it's a waste of time, but it was a huge amount of demands upon my time. And, in those days, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have email. So I'd get all these phone calls at my office. They'd be forwarded to my home phone. I'd get letters in the mail. People would dump whole, gigantic boxes or valises of information, written information about their cases or their kids' cases. And, I just became the sort of intake for all this stuff that was going on nationally because I was in the news and it fed upon each other. And so, maybe it was the late '80s when I think it was the Night Stalker incident happened, which became national news.
Richard Ramirez.
Richard Ramirez, and right,
Sorry.
And he had used the satanic pentagram, and that event, along with the kind of, hyping a lot of this stuff on the media. There was a book by I can't remember her name right now, but it was called Michelle Plaster. That's it. Michelle Remembers, about someone who had been in hypnotic regression and remembered being a victim of these satanic cults. Well, I didn't pay any attention to that, but that got really fed into the news media cycle, and everybody was talking about it. So all of a sudden, there was this interest in Satanism, and I knew a little bit. It was mostly what was going on locally. That article I wrote apparently caused a storm of protest among the people who were either sympathetic to Satanism, who were identified as Satanists in the Bay Area, and they all, began to kind of trash me. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have Wikipedia at the time, but it's like, well, you're defaming us and so forth. So, finally it became kind of a national sensation, and there was a guy I knew, was actually a former student of mine from years ago, who was now working with HarperCollins, and he, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. I did have a former student, but it was a professor who was working with HarperCollins, and they were tasked with finding an academic would write a book and explain all this in what they considered to be a responsible manner. So I had a lot of information. I had a lot of, informants and so forth. And I said, well, sure, why not? I'll answer the call. And that's how the book came about. Satanism was not what I was really interested in at the time, but it was engaging. It was sexy. There was a lot of, disinformation, a lot of propaganda out there by different sides of the fact there were the sort of, evangelicals, or I would call evangelical fundamentalists, who were, talking about Satan under every tree, and, international cults of Satanists. I never had any evidence for that. I know there are international cults, particularly among the elite. Would you call them Satanists? No, it's a little more sophisticated. Now, that's been the narrative. Well, it's even been thrown at me that, this is all about conspiracy theories about international cults of Satanists in high places, and Raschke's promoting this. You know, I did nothing of the kind. It was in the context of that where I was approached by Dale Griffiths, who was a ex-police captain, and he introduced me to a lot of his police officer friends. They already had their own network. It was called 125. I was the only academic who was asked to join. And so they fed me a lot of information. Some of that went in the book, and also people he knew. And
just sorry to interrupt, but Dale Griffiths unfortunately passed away in 2020, and he had his own kind of library of files. And I talked to Dale Griffiths once I published Abomination about the West Memphis Three, which is a whole nother can of worms. But sadly, he's passed away. But his files, I mean, like you said, pre-internet, he kept voluminous records in it.
Right.
I know people who've seen his stuff. Sorry.
Yeah, and honestly, I never saw all of his files, but he would regularly introduce me to people and pass information, to me and so forth. And he also had a lot of connections in federal law enforcement. So sometimes I get calls from them to ask me about that. Now, realizing the FBI at that period was very skeptical of, Satanism. And they had their own, kind of guy who really
Lanning report. It's known as a Lanning report.
Yeah, he, as far as I know, he wasn't really officially representing the FBI, but he kind of fudged it so people thought, well, this is the, FBI, perspective, and it wasn't, But he was always in the news, and he was leveraged by what I later called cult apologists to sort of, well, here's an FBI agent, has a different point of view and so forth. And actually, I got approached in the 1990s by somebody, and I don't know if he knew Lanning or not, but he claimed to be speaking for Lanning. It was in this kind of dark restaurant when I was meeting for something else, and I was kind of shocked. And he said that, well, Ken Lanning would like you to stop criticizing. Was a kind of an implicit threat, and that true story happened. I don't know if he actually had a connection to Lanning or not. I have no evidence he did, but it was like Lanning was used in a whole variety of contexts. Whether he actually participated or let it happen, or what his own role was, I don't know. I never met the guy. I did criticize his public stance. And, that was it.
Just sorry to interrupt. Just a break. I criticized Lanning in a conversation I had with Ken and me, so people can go look at my earlier interview with Ken about the Lanning report. We kind of took it apart, and it's not. I mean, a lot of it's kind of like people misrepresent what he said, but it's not very well argued, and it's not factually based like your book has. You have one chapter with just tons of occult crime cases. So
yeah, a lot of that I got out of local newspapers. It was an interesting thing that, people would say, the critics, but they didn't know what to deal with it because I had all this factual information, and they would also argue, well, why didn't you have footnotes to it? That's because it was trying to be promoted as a trade book, and you don't put footnotes in trade books. I mean, it's as simple as that, but it was all from microfiches. I mean, I did a lot of research. I went around to different parts of the country, went into the archives. For example, the whole story of what happened at Matamoros in Brownsville, I actually went down to Brownsville, and the guy who did most of the investigative reporting on that story, which never got outside the Brownsville, Texas newspaper, he gave me his whole file on the situation. That's how I was able to write the second chapter on Matamoros, which they came back and says, well, this really wasn't a Satanist cult. Well, I mean, these are just all word games in a lot of ways. Later I began to say, okay, let's use the word blood occultism, where essentially you're trying to get, quote, magical power by committing violence, torture, or having the experience of blood. It's a very common phenomenon that anthropologists study in various cultures. And it was adopted, particularly like people like Ramirez. I mean, and the Night Stalker, Son of Sam, and all that.
Constanza.
Yeah.
Right. You write about that. You add like Mayan, Aztec things. Like
Yeah.
he was a modern kind of Aztec priest in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we call it Satanism. The whole question was, Satanism has not been a single phenomena down through the ages, and that's what I tried to explain. I mean, even today there are people that are all over the place that call themselves Satanists. Look like something like the Temple of Set that Michael Aquino started, the Temple of Satan, Lucian Greaves, the Church of Satan that was started by Anton LaVey. I had a very interesting conversation after I wrote the book Painted Black with one of Anton LaVey's children. And it was a very cordial conversation. It was right after an interview. And I actually signed a copy of Painted Black and gave it to her dad because he said he liked the book. It's like, okay, I mean, that's what you told me, and so, the critics always talked about hysteria, and they say I promoted the hysteria. Well, the hysteria was already there, and the cult apologists were as much responsible for the hysteria. First of all, misrepresenting themselves half the time as legitimate academics, and they weren't. They're just people with degrees. They're all bonded together in like this ridiculous organization. It was something I don't even call the scientific study of religion, not the legitimate organizations out there, Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, but it sounded like that. It sounded very authoritative. And that they create these little cartels, and they were masters at getting press. So all of a sudden you had all this kind of hype about the Satanist menace. And by the way, that subtitle, I didn't choose that. The publisher chose that to sell the book. I didn't even know that was on the book until they released it. So I had a more sober subtitle on it. And then of course when the publisher got all the pushback, then they sort of said, we don't, we didn't mean it. We didn't do that, But it's like to this day, I don't think there's been an honest discussion of what really happened during that period. I tried to do one, but it's like everybody's. It's sort of like what's going on in the Ukraine. You listen to Putin, and it's like it's ridiculous what they say, but some people believe it because it fits their mentality, it fits their narrative. One of the points that I was pushing throughout the book is and a lot of my critics were the time were people on the cultural left. How can these are just abused, misfortunate people, and like the Night Stalker and so forth. And I said, well, there's a strong element of neo-fascism and neo-Nazism. That was, of course, explicit in Anton LaVey's own book. He talks about he talks about the Nazis. There was the werewolf order that his children were involved in. That was celebrating, the fanatics who tried at the very last minute when Allied armies were marching on Berlin to stop them by doing acts of terrorism and so forth. So there was this kind of romanticism, which I call aesthetic terror in the book, So I try to be as nuanced as I can, but then you get these, people like the guy who basically did all that stuff in Wikipedia. There's one guy, I found out who he was. I actually tried to shut him down, and I'm not going to go into that, how I did that. But and to this day, I know his name, and as far as I can tell, he was connected with a satanic organization in the Northeast.
Wow, not surprised. Michael Aquino too was a full Nazi fetishist. He had Nazi daggers. He went to Wewelsburg Castle, which was the head of the SS under Himmler. He called it the Wewelsburg working. So he was the full thing, and he killed himself a couple of years ago. So I did a whole show about that too.
He killed himself. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I never know how he died.
Yeah, somebody, an intrepid researcher got his death certificate, and he, in San Francisco, he put a gun to his head. So, but it is interesting. A lot of these guys, like I know some of the names of the critiques on your Wikipedia page. This Wouter Hanegraaff is an academic of the occult in Europe. So of course he's going to say that. Almost all the people will call me a satanic panic person, or
yeah. Actually, I've actually met him personally in Amsterdam, and I asked him very nicely. I said, because I was doing a sabbatical at the time, I said, "Can I come work with you and we can talk about this?" And he was very kind of standoffish and said no. So.
But there are academics in Europe that are full-time occultists. Marco Pazzi, some of these other characters. When I was researching Crowley, that's their life. Is that it's really fascinating.
Well, yeah, and that's the whole thing about religious studies as a field, that you have people that are more than kind of observers; they're participant observers, and a lot of them have gone over to the side of what they're studying. For example, a lot of people don't know about how the whole field was dominated by huge amounts of what we might call monetary influence of people in religious studies back in the 80s and 90s, particularly Unification Church, which wasn't technically a satanic cult, but we know about the Sun Myung Moon. He was into sex magic and so forth. And, there was also a study that was, well, it wasn't a study, it was a congressional report back in the late 70s. I'm trying to, who was the senator from Idaho, whose name was
the Church Report?
Church, yeah, the Church Report. Or did that have to do with the Kennedy assassination?
I think that was it was the Church. Was it HUAC? I don't remember. But the Church thing was, they were looking into the CIA, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, and this was on the Korean CIA and its connection to the Unification Church and how the two were intertwined. The one thing that I have known, and nothing's ever been written about it because you can't get the documentation. You can find stuff in old CIA files if you know where to look that kind of hints at it. And that is that, basically looking back now, I say that a lot of the so-called cult wars was simply an information war, trying to find people who could be bought, and many people were bought, or at least they were said, just like the tobacco company was. I mean, academics are notorious for, being bought. I hate to say that, but it's true, on all sides. And they went along with, ridiculous narratives. You look at a lot of these books that are talking about the Satan scare, or the what is it?
Satanic Panic. They love that.
Satanic Panic. But if you actually look at those books, there's no evidence they write. They're just all quoting each other. So there's no original source of actual data. They've just got this kind of narrative, this theory, which people like Lanning would regularly spout. What they do is they play the authority card, which a lot of it they basically invent their own credentials, because let's look at it. I mean, if media is untrustworthy now, in those days it wasn't so much that media was unscrupulous. It's like people didn't know what they were talking about. That's one reason I got interviewed so much on the New Age movement by media coming out the wazoo. It's like, well, I saw you must be the authority because I saw you quoted somewhere else, blah, blah, blah. And I knew how to talk to the media. I would talk to them. I'd explain it in detail, and they'd swoon and say, oh, that's wonderful. That's great. And so, they also have publicity agents. And so these groups had their own publicity agents, and they were very effective, because the media up until about that time that book came out in 1990, and the paperback came out in 1991, was all buying into the Satanic Panic. It wasn't academics, it wasn't police officers, social workers who built it up. It was the media built it up. And then all of a sudden, just like at a dime, just like the weather in Kansas, everything turned, and it all became delusion.
Right. You mentioned he got disconnected for a second, but he mentioned, actually, Carl mentioned, like, the propaganda that's used against the reality of in my opinion, of satanic influence crime, which I think is pretty obvious. If you just look at all the facts and all the cases. He interestingly mentioned in the book, he mentioned John Doe 60, which was a satanic crime in San Francisco, and there's a picture of that on Dave McGowan's cover of Program to Kill, which is still influential. It's still an influential book. But Carl goes into appeal to authority, inversion of the subject, pseudo distinction, thought stopping cliches, genetic fallacy. Really interesting. Like, so much in this book is like many of the people that I've talked to. I've done interviews with Dave McGowan on Ed Opperman Report. You can go listen to those. We talk about the West Memphis Three, but he mentioned Michael Hoffman, who I interviewed about his new book, Twilight Language. So he's mentioned in Painted Black. So it's really kind of a timestamp. I think this book is an important timestamp. That's actually, I mean, it's so different than some of these other style books. I think Carl mentioned some of these evangelical books that may not have the weight I think that Painted Black does, and it has tons of. You can reference these facts. There may not be as many footnotes. It's not an academic book, but you can type in these names, and all these things come up. You know that these cases, Ramirez. He talks about all these occult underground groups. So in a lot of ways, it's a reflection of really kind of the deep knowledge of the Western esoteric tradition, not just kind of the Satanism that's taking place now. But yeah, there's a lot. He mentions cases that I studied. My old occult investigations YouTube channel's gone, but I used to have these cases on one that he did of the Hardy Boys, which was two kids who were in high school who got involved in Satanism, and they killed a guy by the name of Newberry. But so much of this stuff, like I've studied LeVay, I've studied Eliphas Levi, and so he goes into how Eliphas Levi influenced the KKK and Albert Pike. So that was fascinating. So there's a lot. There's a lot going on, and the Cold War is really, like you said. I mean, Kilball's talking about it. It was like an information war. Some information they just wanted to discredit, and you can go look. You can go look at Carl Raschke's Wikipedia page, and half of it, Wikipedia is no longer reliable. And I don't know if it really was reliable at its inception, but there's like the. What is it? The Purple Hair Brigade are these type of people who are adjusting all this stuff and calling everybody Nazis. It's the same type of irresponsible terminology that they use, but it's not objective at all. And so you can see all these people just gangpiling on Carl Raschke about this book. It's really incredible how many people took the time out to try to discredit him or be pissed off at him. So I would recommend people go to, hopefully Carl will come back. He's disconnected according to mine. But yeah, Wikipedia is horrible. You're absolutely right. It's not reliable. There should be some kind of, there's better encyclopedia. You can go to the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's probably better resource. And if you really want a really good resource, this is just a tip. Go to the Encyclopedia Britannica Scholars Edition. Hi, Carl. Welcome back. You just need to get you need to get your mic. Your mic isn't plugged in either. I think you might have knocked out one of the cables, but your mic isn't plugged in. Anyway, so there's a lot in this book that I highly recommend. You can get a copy of Painted Black. I saw it online, but it was put out in the. Oh, now you're good. Perfect.
Yeah,
I was
muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? You're hitting a mute button. Now it's off. Now you're back on.
Yeah,
now you're on. Now you're off. So now you're on.
The system is doing this.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. Let me take you out of this. So it's not on your side. It's got to be on mine.
Right.
Okay, perfect. I think you're coming through perfect. Okay. It might be. Sometimes the system bugs out a little bit, so I apologize for that. I was just kind of talking about some of the cases that I'd studied. I had an old occult investigations page that YouTube took away from me, or Google. I can't even get back into it. But I covered kind of the Hardy Boys. So some of these cases, like, and this was before the West Memphis 3, which I wrote a book about, which is totally occult. And a cultural, like, you want to talk about the aesthetics of terror or the cultural impact of Satanism. The West Memphis 3 is off the charts because a lot of those people surrounding that case, they all are fellow travelers. You start researching them and you realize that they have an affinity for Crowley or Kino or Uleve, or all that stuff comes back. Anyway, Carl, do you have time to take a few questions?
Yeah, sure. I was just trying to figure out what's going on. And also, I've got two cameras on here, and the external camera, which I was using now, I can't figure out how to put it back on. So.
Well, you sound good. So let me see if I can pull up some of these old questions. Hill Doggy asks, do you believe the New Age and Theosophy are similar?
Well, yeah, it was the Theosophical movement. Alice Bailey, who was the kind of third generation, the spiritual granddaughter of Helen Blavatsky, who coined the term. Alice Bailey wrote a lot. She actually had influence on Eleanor Roosevelt, as far as I understand, and a lot of the kind of spiritual ideas behind the United Nations came out of Alice Bailey's work. Yeah, I mean, Theosophy, evolved too. So I would call late stage Theosophy and the New Age are very similar. In fact, you read Alice Bailey's writing, she's always talking about the coming of the New Age. So that's where I've traced the term to.
Gotcha. And then Oswald asks, are you aware of any Satanist infiltration into anthroposophy? I think it's similar to Theosophy, right?
Yes. In fact, there was a case in Denver back in the early 90s where some Satanist-oriented skinheads killed some cops. It was all in the news. I was actually quoted in Time magazine. I think it was, I don't remember what year it was. It was the early 90s, 92, 93. It might have been as late as 1994. It was national news at the time. And the young man who did it was the son of somebody who had been well known for anthroposophical forms of education.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Let's see. What are Carl's thoughts on the human potential movement and its impact? From Joker 37.
Well, it had a tremendous impact now. I mean, it's spent its course, its history. It was the New Age movement was this kind of catch-all term for everything that we would call, essentially 60s countercultural new thought. It was just a kind of grab bag. And of course, you had Maslow, you had Esalen. So, the movement itself is pretty much expired. Things like Esalen are there. The institutionalization, or what Max Weber called the routinization of charisma, is everywhere. I mean, it had a huge impact on culture, and we don't realize how much of an impact it did. It basically changed the whole orientation, and a lot of the kind of globalistic anti-American thinking. It wasn't consciously anti-American. It was just like, well, nation states don't matter. It's all about this spiritual, mystical idea of one world and one humanity. That was Alice Bailey's vision. I mean, that's why the United Nations, its formation, had a lot of this. I mean, you go, excuse me, there's a chapel in New York at the UN that was basically, and it's still there. It was built by Bailey's disciples.
Is it St. John's? Is that the St. John's Chapel? Is that right?
I can't remember the name of it.
Oh, okay. Or there's definitely a chapel inside the UN building with the block of Saturn or whatever. Yeah. Another question is, do you have any run-ins with targeted individuals? I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. I got another question. How did the SRU SR9 Stanford research affect the occult? Do you know anything about that?
I've heard stories about that, but I understand it was more in the realm of parapsychology, which was an effort to try to give some scientific legitimacy to the occult. I mean, it was all a bloom in the 1970s, but I've never pursued looking into it in detail.
Gotcha. Let's see. think there was another one. There it is. Do you think that cult techniques are, in general, are being used by politicians on the left and right today? I guess Oswald's asking that.
Well, it depends what you mean by cult techniques. I mean, let's look at it this way. The Soviets had been studying and leveraging the occult, all the way going back. I mean, take even Blavatsky. Blavatsky was the daughter of a Russian intelligence officer. So that was during the so-called Great Game when Britain and Russia were fighting control of what is now Afghanistan, the Himalayas, and so forth. And if you really, it's no hard evidence, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to show that Blavatsky's whole theosophical movement may have been an effort to counter British influence in India. And it's well known that theosophy had an effect on the Indian independence movement because it called on ancient spiritual ideas of India. Now, there's also a lot of non-Indian stuff, kind of mystify the whole notion of the Aryans, the Aryan race. I mean, that's where Hitler got the idea of the Aryan race. He got it from theosophy. So, intelligence, communities have always been tied in with the occult in different ways, but it's not, again, you want to avoid conspiratorial thinking by saying there's just kind of hard connections there. I mean, we all are influenced by religious ideas, and the occult or the esoteric, which is the more academic way of talking about it, is in effect, one of the main forms of human motivation. In this age where we think social sciences can explain behavior to the correlation of data, we forget it. It's people's most passionate worldview, what they think is ultimate reality, that gets them to do the weird things. Look how we've totally underestimated Putin. Thinking, well, he was just this kind of sly, sort of calculating chess player. And now we say, we're looking at the horrors and the atrocities. He was very much influenced by the Eurasian myth that was promoted by the philosophy of Alexander Dugin, which is based on a kind of specious, romanticized, somewhat weird reading of ancient Russian Orthodoxy and the formation of the Russian state during the Kievan period. I mean, people are motivated by this, and we avoid looking at these strange ideas at our own peril. I can tell you that all intelligence operations understand the power of religion or the power of esoteric beliefs. The drug cartels, which I wrote about in Painted Black. In fact, somebody asked me once in 1990, 1991, can you basically tell me what is the relationship between Satanism, Paulo Mayumbe, this kind of eclectic stuff that somebody like Constanza was using? I said, well, it's basically a kind of like a training program for mules and people who want to maintain loyalty. Later, some of the cartels started shifting to John Eldridge. That's documented. A former colleague of me wrote an article about that. Religion matters. And we live in this age where people think religion is a matter of choice and, I'm secular, I'm an atheist, I understand it. Well, the fact of the matter is people who do things that seem strange or outrageous, or we would call evil, or even the ultimate good, have very strong, deeply structured beliefs about the world, which causes superhuman behavior of some sort. And that's where the occult appeals to. It gives people who feel like they're nobody a sense of power. It even did the same thing for Adolf Hitler, years ago.
Right. No, it's a great point. I mean, these are motivations that play out in the real world. And I think that Lanning ignores a lot of that stuff, that these motivations are there. And I think that a lot of the satanic panic people do not acknowledge that either.
That whole idea is just a propaganda term. I mean, there was no satanic panic. The way the discourse is structured about that. And actually, that a lot of that comes out of some of Lanning's writings, where he talks about where you have all these professionals who've been bought into this fraud. It's like, I knew a lot of these police officers, at the time, and I still know a lot of them. I mean, interesting thing, the FBI now takes Satanism seriously. They have to be very careful because, they can't investigate or prosecute somebody simply for their beliefs. But I made that point over and over again when I was interviewed back in the 90s. Now they understand the kind of motivational factor, particularly since 9/11. When we looked at this kind of strange extremist form of Islam and then ISIS. I mean, all religions have their own potential for extremists. So it's not the case historically, and I am a scholar of religion. It's not the case that religion automatically, creates extremism, particularly people to do violence, but it's very much there. It's part of the very topography of human history because it's a strong motivational force. And, if you're trying to basically have an effect on a culture from outside, if you're trying to engage in active measures, if you're an intelligence community, you're going to try to find ways to manipulate people's religious predilections or religious beliefs, or even give them new kind of experiences, or, to sort of promote this that will change their behavior. And, it goes all the way back to the 19th century and probably before. We just don't have the hard data. And the real problem is now, even when the data is presented, this is what was amazing to me when I wrote Painted Black. I mean, it's full of data. And, there was this massive campaign to make it look like it was just some kind of paranoid conspiracy writing. When it's filled with data that comes from various kind of professional sources, authorized professional sources, including journalistic sources, credible journalistic sources. And people will say, well, that authority says it's, I shouldn't take it seriously. People still do that today. People believe what they want to believe until something actually affects them directly, and then they change their mind.
Right. And that's Michael Aquino's death certificate. You can barely read it, but it says contact, gunshot, wound to the head. I think the date is, he was 72, and I think it was 2021 or 2020. I can't see the date.
Does it say suicide on there?
It says his address was 2400 Leavenworth Street, San Francisco. You grew up in that area, so he was on Leavenworth. I think he was close to Nob Hill.
I didn't grow up there.
Oh, no. Oh, I should be looking here. Disposition date 9/10/2019. So he died in 2019.
Yeah, I knew he died, but I don't know. Interesting.
So anyway, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed before we wrap up the discussion about this book?
No, I just wish academics would not, live in their own la la land. I mean, this kind of stuff is going on today, and we pay a lot of money for college education, and so much of this is just narrative. It's ideology looking for confirmation, and I can tell you the way I expected Painted Black. I wasn't doing it for money or for notoriety. I already had that in the academic world. I thought I was doing it as a service to the public, to try to get some facts rather than get all these accusations and counter accusations. But we know that there is no good deed that goes unpunished. And in fact, people wanted the book all the time. The book's not out of print because it didn't sell. It's out of print because the publisher basically caved to all the criticism. They didn't reprint it. People really want to read this book. They need to be put pressure on HarperCollins because that's why people will look. They'll go out there. Oh, I found a copy of this, in some used bookstore. It's the fact that it's still in demand today because nobody's really written a book like it. I know there's some other serious books that have come along in the time, but again, this is the only academic book that I know that's ever been written on the topic, don't regret it. I'm just kind of amazed of how, how the book got treated, and which tells me it was a very dangerous book. The historical facts that he talks about there are now 30 years old. A lot of the people like Aquino, you mentioned, are dead. But there's still people who want you to believe that this is just all some kind of, ultra right-wing paranoid conspiracy. Satanism is, and it's not. It's, it's real. I've talked to so many of these people that have been affected by my life. I don't deal with this hardly anymore. I don't research it. I don't write about it. I rarely get interviewed, but interestingly, when I do get interviewed, I get interviewed in a serious way, like now. So, the whole story has not been told. And there's a lot more I could go on and talk about that, we don't have time.
But I think that you placed this book at the time, like people need to go back, and I mentioned this when you kind of dropped off. It really has stood the test of time because of its, focus on facts and real stories. So I do recommend people go back and look at this, because it's not just about current Satanism. Your book goes all the way back through the Western esoteric tradition to the present.
Right.
So
yeah.
You have to see all of that in context. And too, you mentioned a lot of others. I mean, your knowledge, very knowledgeable about.
Yeah, and I would say there are differences when you start interpreting the historical background. There are reasonable differences of opinion. I've had criticisms. Well, you missed this, tie into Catharism. Well, I mean, there are books out there. I try to follow a logic that makes sense, because we don't have data. All we have are essentially narratives from people who were not factual historians. The whole obsession with factual history is a modern invention. You don't even see it before the 17th century. So there's no way of knowing exactly what really happened. But, there are also very educated guesses to try to find themes and patterns. And that's what I tried to do.
Yeah. So kudos to you for having the courage to put this book together. It's really a great book. I really enjoyed reading through it today. For people who want to reach out to you or see some of your other work, or kind of get an idea of all of your knowledge about the history of religion, where's the best place where people find that?
Well, they can go to my website. It's carlraschke.com. It lists all the books I've published.
Gotcha. So I'll put that in the show notes. Carl Raschke. And if people have any additional questions, reach out to you there.
But I can please ask you, not to, if you've got some kind of personal issue or case about something, don't write me helping me. I can solve it. Start studying the thing yourself, and it's because it does take a perspective. It's just it's like being people that can't be healthy because they're overwhelmed by junk food. You can be overwhelmed with junk information. Wikipedia is a good example of that. I mean, once that basically that whole part of Satanism was written by one guy within a 3-week period of time, who was out to really, because I hadn't been on Wikipedia before, and he had actually been involved historically in Wikipedia. I determined that, and so he could get away with a lot of stuff. But tell him to read my son Eric's article. It was called Wrathful Wiccan Wikipedians. It's a funny article. It's a true story of how that whole thing came. And it makes Wikipedia, look like ridiculous. So, academics for years have always said, to their students, don't use Wikipedia. It's not authoritative. But this is a perfect example of how ridiculous Wikipedia can be.
Right. Well, it's only getting worse. It's only getting worse.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of other things where they're coming on and they're all the red-haired, purple-haired brigade, just like besmirching all kinds of people. So it's not just. Thanks so much for the talk. I really appreciate it. I'm really.
You're welcome.
Again, the title of the book, Painted Black: From Drug Killings to Heavy Metal: The Alarming True Story of How would you subtitle it?
I don't know right now.
Okay, well, I didn't mean to
painted black. What really is going on with Satanism or something like that? I think that
Painted Black. What's really going on? So it's all. I mean, look at the facts, folks. Go read this book. Yeah. Published 1990. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, is this going to be recorded? By the way, is it going to be a recording of this?
this is recorded. Once I hit the stop button, which I have,
Oh, okay.
we'll be right. Hold on. I'll hit the stop button. I'll hit the stop.